This is the OrangePi 5 Plus, which is an SBC or single board computer. It's a tiny pocket-sized PC which is perfect for lab use, as a tinkerer device, and for DIY projects, thanks to its plentiful I/O and GPIO pins. The OrangePi 5 Plus specifically has a Rockchip RK3588 CPU, which is insanely powerful. How powerful, you ask? Well, along with functioning really great as a day-to-day PC with desktop operating systems, it can also play a large host of modern games including Fortnite, PUBG, and Call of Duty Mobile. And it can emulate games up to and including GameCube and PS2, whilst absolutely conquering the likes of PSP, Dreamcast, N64, and more. So here we have an incredibly powerful computer that fits in the palm of your hand, plays all sorts of games, and has a whole host of inputs and outputs. And remember when I said that this type of SBC is perfect for DIY? Well, you're going to want to stick around through this video because I'll show you how I turned it into an awesome all-in-one desktop games console using all off-the-shelf parts, a little 3D printing, and admittedly a little trial and error too. Oh, and did I mention that it uses Steam Deck speakers? By the way, I want to say a big thanks to the sponsor of this video who made this project possible, AliExpress. Yes, that AliExpress. The thing is that AliExpress is by far the best place to buy tech like retro handhelds, tablets, gadgets, and well, basically anything else you could want, including the OrangePi 5 Plus. And you always get the lowest possible prices that you'll find anywhere, with all the modern conveniences of online shopping, including buyer protection, fast shipping, and free returns. The team at AliExpress have provided some unique promo codes for my viewers that'll get you exclusive discounts on the OrangePi 5 Plus, just in case you'd like to try building your own games console, or you just fancy checking it out as a basic PC or for tinkering. I'll put those on screen and in the description box below. But anyway, let's take a closer look at the OrangePi 5 Plus. This SPC is available in many different configurations and options, including different RAM sizes and different accessories. But at the core, the CPU here is the Rockchip 3588 SoC, which has 8 cores. That's 4 Cortex A76 cores at 2.4 GHz, and 4 Cortex A55 cores at 1.8 GHz. Paired with that is a Mali G610 GPU, which is amazingly powerful. The available RAM options are 4, 8, 16, and there's even a 32GB version of this board too, but it's a little harder to get. And from here, honestly, I could go on about specs for a million years, so instead of doing that, let's take a look at the board itself. This is the most basic option available on AliExpress, with no extra accessories other than what's listed on the page and 4GB of RAM. And even this is fully loaded. It comes shipped in a plastic box and in an anti-static bag. And it also comes with a free cooling fan, a set of heat sinks, and a simple acrylic case, which is great. And you even get a power supply included, which is 5 volts and 4 amps. And that provides more than enough power to max out the potential of this board. If you don't want to mess around with extra accessories and stuff like that, this is really all you need to get started. Anyway, here's the OrangePi 5 Plus itself. In the center here you can see the Rockchip RK3588 chip, the RAM chip, and a bunch of other interesting bits and pieces. There's an M.2 E-key slot for a network card, and these two parallel connectors house the optional eMMC module. There's a connector for a fan, a beeper, a real-time clock module, and well, a ton more, as you can see in this official diagram. On the underside there's an M.2 M-key slot for a full-size 2280 solid-state drive, a microSD card slot, and options to add an MIPI DSi LCD screen, touch interface, and a camera, all of which OrangePi sells as well. When it comes to I/O, on the backside you have a 5V 4A Type-C port for power, dual 2.5GB Ethernet ports, dual HDMI out and a single HDMI in, and 2 USB 2.0 ports. On the front side there's a USB 3.0 Type-C connector which includes DisplayPort out, 2 USB-A 3.0 ports, a power button, an IR receiver, a microphone, and an audio output, aka headphone jack. And then of course you have the 40-pin GPIO header for all of your electronics projects needs. For such a compact SBC that is so powerful, the OrangePi 5 Plus is the very definition of an uncompromised device. It has quite literally all the inputs, outputs, and features you could ever possibly need, whether you're looking for a simple mini PC, or a project device, or whatever else your imagination could dream up. But in realistic terms, what can the OrangePi actually, well, do? Firstly, as a PC, there are several operating systems available, both official and unofficial. You can choose to boot from the SD card slot, an NVMe SSD drive, or the eMMC module. Available systems include OrangePi's own optimized system based on Arch Linux, OpenHarmony, or Android. And then there's unofficial builds such as Ubuntu, Arch Linux, Debian, Armbian, and even an early version of Windows on ARM, but we're not going to talk about that here. Also, there are proper AOSP-based Android builds available too. This here is a distro called Ubuntu Rockchip by Joshua Riek. There's a great build of this available for the 5 Plus that honestly works perfectly. With an operating system like this, you have all the power of a full desktop OS, and everything you need for basic computer use like web browsing, document editing, video playback up to and including 4K video, and if you have a good cooling setup, you can even handle heavier tasks like light image editing, maybe some video editing, and even gaming and emulation. Depending on the RAM size you choose, you can multitask easily too. However, admittedly it's not ideal on this 4GB model specifically. For embedded tasks, you have tons of options with the 5 Plus. HDMI input means that you can receive and process a video signal as well as putting one out. For example, to work something like a capture card. Dual Ethernet means that you can hook up a network switch and use this as a router or something like a NAS or another server. You could even set up a dedicated Minecraft server, a Jellyfin or Plex server for media, or how about a torrent box? For free and open source content only, of course. And then of course there's the potential for gaming, and on the OrangePi 5 Plus the opportunities are practically endless. You can game on a desktop OS like Debian or Ubuntu for Linux native games and emulators, or you can use a dedicated gaming OS such as Batocera, EmuElec or Rocknix, all of which are available. In particular, Rocknix is very convenient and in active development, and it works absolutely great. It serves as a way to instantly set up a fast and performant retro gaming centric games console. I should mention though that since the Rockchip RK3588 is an ARM architecture chip, Steam gaming is not really feasible here except in a very experimental way. The final and in my opinion absolute best way to game on the OrangePi 5 Plus is using Android OS. There are a few options available, all based on Android 12. The OrangePi OS Droid Edition is a somewhat desktop-oriented custom build for if you're using a mouse and keyboard. But there's also the mostly AOSP tablet build and an Android TV build available too. I always love to go with a stock Android build, and the one available for this device is absolutely awesome. It's extremely minimal with a tiny GApps package, just enough to make the Play Store work with no bloatware at all. The user interface is nice and snappy, and the system itself seems very stable. For those working on DIY projects, you can access the GPIO header in Android too. With the Google Play Store pre-installed, there are absolutely hundreds of games already available. Of course, not every Android game can be played with a controller or a mouse and keyboard, but many, such as Minecraft, work just fine. And the OrangePi 5 Plus has full 3D hardware acceleration in Android, so 3D games work exceptionally well. Now I'm sure that you are raring to see some proper gaming and emulation performance on this device, and I want to show you that as well. But well, right now I just have this little PCB hooked up to my PC monitor, which isn't very fun, and it doesn't look great either. But since this is a tinkerer or DIY type of device, I wanted to do something tinkerery and DIY-y with it. So I decided to build my own all-in-one desktop games console. I'm calling it the RBAIO 5, or the ShemStation 5, or perhaps the Super NinShemDo. The primary design goal for this project was to have a desktop-based all-in-one games console that only requires the user to plug in a power cable to use, with the exception of bringing your own wired or wireless controller, of course. So let's go over what I used for this project. Firstly, the OrangePi 5 Plus is at the center, and you've probably noticed this little micro USB cable that I've soldered directly onto the pads of the Pi's USB 2.0 connector. This is because we're going to need some USB power for the screen, and by soldering directly to the pads, we've eliminated one external USB cable. This way we don't need a USB cable plugged into the Pi directly. The connection will be on the inside, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. When it comes to the screen, we have this 5-inch OCA laminated IPS display from Elecro. This display has a native resolution of 800 by 480 and an aspect ratio of 5:3, which makes it great for retro gaming. Also, it uses QLED technology, which has great colors and great vibrancy. It connects via HDMI, with touch and power coming from a micro USB connector, which is what we'll use that cable for. Also, it has a headphone jack for audio output, and onboard controls to calibrate and tweak the image. This is on AliExpress too, by the way, and I'll link all of this stuff I'm using below. Next up is this PAM8403 5-watt amplifier. This helps us get loud and good audio from our speakers. And speaking of speakers, our little amp is wired up to these official Steam Deck speakers. You can buy these as a replacement part for repair purposes over at the Immaculate iFixit, but I said screw the rules and thought I'd use them in my project here. And I wanted to use these speakers specifically because I remember the Steam Deck having just amazing sound quality, and I really wanted my all-in-one to have really good compact speakers too. Did it work? Well, you'll have to wait and see. Next up is the included fan. It's just a simple always-on 5-volt fan. The orangepi 5 Plus definitely benefits from cooling under load, and this will just move some air around, but it's really nothing special. Now this is interesting. This is an FPC HDMI cable. FPC stands for Flexible Profile Circuit, and it's basically a flat cable that's flexible. Imagine that. On one end is this HDMI that's at 90 degrees, and on the other end is a straight HDMI connector. But you can see how low profile they are. And we'll be using this low profile connector to connect the screen and the orangepi 5 Plus in a low profile way. And next up is the magic of 3D printing. And here I have 4 3D printed parts: the bottom of the base, the top of the base, and the front and the back of the screen assembly. I spent a long time designing this device over 2 distinct iterations. As a little spoiler, here's the original design in action. The problem with this was that for such a small device, the screen being straight on didn't work at all, because I was never really at eye level with this device. So I updated the design to this one, which has a pivoting screen that can be adjusted to the viewer's preference. And I was really happy with this design overall. And with all that in mind, let's go ahead and build. After 3D printing the parts, I used heatset inserts on the bottom and the top of the base. These melt into the plastic using the soldering iron for a rock solid fit, and they're threaded on the inside and will let us screw everything together tightly. I'm using a steel straight edge to make sure the heatset inserts are straight and flush. Now it's time to insert the 3D printed hinge parts. These press very, very firmly into the 2 holes on the top part of the base, and I decided to glue them down with some plastic glue just for some extra security too. Then I did the same with the back screen assembly part. This is just a single part which again I locked in place with glue. You'll see how this all works later. Now for a fun part, inserting the screen. The Eloquer screen has these handy screw hand prong thingies that allow us to mount the screen securely in place. To help facilitate this, I decided to have the screws come in from the front of the screen assembly. This means that the screw actually pulls toward the case as it gets tighter for a flusher fit. The back part of the screen assembly actually doesn't have those heatset inserts I showed earlier. Instead, these screws will simply bore into the plastic of the back casing. By the way, this hole in the back here is so that I can still access the screen's buttons in a pinch. And now for the speakers. I already had the PAM8403 wired up, and it's pretty simple. You have outputs for the positive and negative terminal on both the left and right speakers, a left and right channel input along with ground, and then there's simply a positive and negative 5-volt connector for power. I applied some hot glue to these wires because I thought they were too small and fragile. This ended up doing nothing and they all broke off anyway and I had to redo it. First I soldered the speaker inputs directly to the screen's headphone jack. For this connector, the deepest terminal is the left channel, the middle terminal is the right channel, and the shallowest terminal is ground. These wires do the exact same thing as a headphone connector would. Next I inserted the right speaker because the wire was short, and then I stuck the amp in place with double-sided tape. The speakers themselves simply stick into their housing using pre-applied sticky stuff, and handily the wires have sticky tabs on them as well. For the rest of the wires I just put some Velcro on to keep them roughly in the right place. Sue me. Now comes the fiddly part, getting everything together. First, the speaker power connector has a 2-pin jack on the end, which plugs into the 5-volt and ground pins on the orangepi 5 Plus. The flat HDMI cable plugs into its slot on the screen, followed by the USB cable. And all of these cables have to channel through the small slot on the top part of the base, then up through the slot in the bottom part of the screen assembly. At this point I remembered about the fan. Unfortunately its wires were just too short, so I very poorly extended them, and in violation of international law I soldered these wires directly to free 5-volt and ground pins on the orangepi 5 Plus. Again, you can sue me. After a quick check to confirm that the fan was working, I popped it onto the legs at the top of the casing and set about closing up the bottom case. I opted to actually break off one of the tabs for the HDMI cable, just to ensure that it wouldn't get crushed by the plastic, and the hole is covered by the HDMI connector itself anyway. And now came the first major problem with this build. Oh, you didn't think it would go smoothly, did you? No, it didn't. On the bottom of the case there should be 4 screw holes, and they're covered by support material that should pop out easily. But it quite simply just didn't. No matter what, I just couldn't cleanly get this out at all. Because of this, the screws were unbelievably stiff to get in, and they wouldn't go in all the way either. Ideally, these screws should go all the way up into the plastic so that the base sits flat on the table with rubber feet. However, it just wasn't possible to get them in all the way. So I ended up just having them stick out a bit, which I guess is fine for now. I also noticed at this point a bulge in the base. Something here just doesn't quite have enough room, and I think it's the USB 3.0 ports. Still, I just decided to go ahead and pursue this. The next step was to ensure that all of the wires went through the slot in the screen assembly and then attach the back cover. But at this point, disaster. Unfortunately, my DIY USB cable was simply too big for the slot, which caused bulging and pressure and meant that the back corner of the screen just didn't screw on right. In addition, the FPC HDMI cable here was just way too short, which meant that there was excess pressure on it, to the point where, off screen when I was trying to get this all together, it simply ripped. Now at this point I considered going back to the drawing board and redesigning and printing a bunch of parts, but it was all just right here already, so I didn't really want to do that. I also had a spare FPC cable laying around, but it was still a bit too short. So I needed to solve two problems. The USB cable is too thick, and the HDMI cable is too short. So what I decided to do was change up the wiring a little bit. I ended up ordering a longer micro USB FPC cable. I then clipped my DIY cable off, and then soldered the wires directly to the new flat FPC connector, and then I glued that to the top of the case. I then used the short FPC cable I already had to connect the FPC micro USB connector that you see here. Apologies for the poor footage, I was very weary at this point. Then I connected the HDMI input and output with the longer FPC cable and routed it all the way through any gaps I could find in the case. And now with these flat cables I had plenty of room. With that disaster averted, I used a long screw and bolt to connect the hinges of the screen and base together. This isn't super stiff, but it works well enough for general adjustments, and the screen stays wherever you leave it. As I went to reassemble the bottom case though, the fan broke one of the pins and was hanging loose, so I decided to just hot glue it in place. And yes, that is me using a sharp craft knife to push the very last drops of glue I had out of the gun. Sue me again, please. Actually don't, but just don't try this at home. With the honestly too long HDMI cable routed, just freaking anywhere I could place it, I lightly got everything together and powered my project on for the first time. And to my absolute delight, it booted up, the screen switched on, and the touchscreen input worked. Here's my first test play of Gundam Battle Assault on PS1, running on Rocknix OS. Honestly, I was absolutely buzzing at this point. Here's some Soul Calibur Broken Destiny on PSP. Oh, and the speakers, whilst having some issues that we'll talk about a little bit later, sounded absolutely incredible. I am genuinely shocked by how good this sounds. It is just awesome. And with all that done, I was happy to screw the rest of the screws in and call this project finished. Psych! You didn't think this would be such a happy ending, did you? Actually, there are a few problems. I realized at this point that network connectivity is essential for Android, and that having an Ethernet plugged in all the time violated my original one external cable rule. Not to mention Bluetooth would be really useful for accessories and wireless audio. The other problem is that on Android specifically, this thing was really slow when booting from the SD card. And when installing any game or accessing the disk in any way, like file transfers for example, the entire system became completely unusable. Installing Combat Master, which is a modest Android game, took over an entire hour to install. Also, the games themselves seem to have constant lag and stuttering on the Android side too. So I made the decision once again, off screen, to get an NVMe SSD drive for the OS and an Android compatible Bluetooth and Wi-Fi 6E card. I didn't film myself installing these because it's just repetition of what you've already seen. However, the difference with the NVMe drive is absolutely night and day. The console now boots in seconds and is absolutely blazing fast. And this PCIe 3 solid state drive connection is even faster than eMMC is in a smartphone, for example. It is just absolutely amazing. And now navigating the OS, installing apps, and gaming is super silky smooth. And so with network and a fast disk added, I'm happy to finally call this project finished. And here it is, the RBAIO5, aka the ShemStation 5, aka Super NinShemDo. Now this isn't 100% perfect, but before we talk about any potential for improvement or whatever, let's go over how the super sick DIY games console games. And spoilers, the performance here is just awesome. And may I say, so is the form factor. Let's take a look at some Android native gaming first. And first up, we're going to be looking at the Android version of Fortnite. This has of course been installed from Epic Games, and all the settings are the default. I'm not exactly sure what the frame rate is here, but it's absolutely silky smooth. The graphics look pretty great too, and I didn't experience any stutters or lag at all, whether I was driving, shooting, or surrounded by enemies. I was able to play through entire matches with absolutely no problem at all. And this performance for Fortnite is absolutely amazing. And so if you want to build a tiny Fortnite box, well, you can use the orangepi 5 Plus for that. Next up is Rush Rally 3. This game actually benchmarks your device on its first boot, and then sets the appropriate graphics settings for a smooth 60 FPS experience. And it works absolutely perfectly. The game is totally locked in at 60 FPS and looks absolutely fantastic on this little display. By the way, you might notice a slightly hazy display on my console from here on out. That's because something I found is that the display was so reflective that it was picking up my camera and the reflection every time. So I applied an anti-glare screen protector that unfortunately dulled the image quite a lot. Anyway, just ignore that. And here's Combat Master, which is one of my absolute favorite Android games. And again, it runs absolutely perfectly. This game is ultra fast paced and the orangepi 5 Plus keeps up perfectly. I feel like this was actually one of my best matches ever and I came in first place. Make of that what you will. Next up is the old trusty Vampire Survivors. This game of course runs perfectly even with a gajillion enemies and projectiles on screen. The only problem is that whenever I pick up this game to test it, I have to play for a good 40 minutes or so. And finally, let's look at Roblox, which is apparently a popular game. And in all my testing, this was the only game that wouldn't run at all on this platform. I'm not sure if you need an ultra high-end device for Roblox or if there's some kind of driver incompatibility or something, but yeah, this was nowhere near remotely playable. And finally, let's look at Minecraft. Minecraft runs flawlessly on the orangepi 5 Plus, even with a maxed out render distance of 12 chunks. And it looks absolutely great. And this is just a great little game to play on this little games console. It's kind of a fun way to pick up and play Minecraft whenever I feel like it. And now let's look at some retro game emulation. And of course, all the really old stuff is totally maxed out here, with all 2D systems and anything below PS1 running absolutely perfect. But actually, there's a lot more than that going on here too. Dreamcast runs perfectly as well, even with upscaling to at least 720p, which isn't really necessary on my device, but I tried it anyway. Dead or Alive 2 here is a heavy hitter Dreamcast game that often lags, but it's running perfectly here. So I'm pretty confident to say that most, if not all, Dreamcast games are going to run perfectly on this device. N64 is similarly impressive, with every single game running maxed out. Diddy Kong Racing here is running absolutely perfectly without a single hitch, which means that my console can easily play the best racing game of all time. Awesome. When it comes to PSP, once again the orangepi 5 Plus has it covered. And this little game console will play all the hardest games, including God of War back when it was good, and outrun 2006 absolutely flawlessly. Again, when we're thinking about an SBC kinda like the Raspberry Pi, this is tremendously impressive performance. Every time. And now onto the heavy hitters, starting with Nintendo GameCube. And there is, surprisingly, not all that much that doesn't run extremely well here. At this level we may not reach perfect performance, but we are very comfortably in the realm of playable. For example, Shadow the Hedgehog, which usually lags on the first level, is playing really well here, with a very smooth full speed frame rate and only the occasional stutter here and there. Soul Calibur 2 is one game that runs completely flawlessly, without even a single hitch. Absolutely perfect and looks wonderful on my game console screen. Sonic Heroes is another game with flawless performance on the orangepi 5 Plus. And just in case I hadn't said it enough already, I still cannot believe we're reaching this level of performance on an SBC. And finally, let's take a look at Super Smash Bros. Melee, which even with a 4-player match, runs perfectly. This is the last time I'm gonna say it, but this performance is incredible for an SBC. And now let's take a look at PS2. Now in my opinion, PS2 on Android is just not very good right now, and it seems to be a very buggy and uneven experience. That said, a few games I tried here did work well, and for these tests I'm using the latest NetherSX2 app. Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution is one of the best fighting games on PS2, and I'm happy to say that this is picture perfect performance. On the other hand, Dragon Quest VIII is very laggy and slow. However, the weird thing is that I can actually fast forward this game to 300% and it will run perfectly smoothly. What I'm saying here is that I think that the performance of this SBC should be enough to run the game. I just think there's some bugginess with the software and emulation. Another game that runs surprisingly well is Ratchet & Clank 2 up your, well, you know. There are a few stutters sprinkled around here and there, but in general, I mean, this is running more than well enough to be playable and enjoyable, and that's even with many enemies and particles on screen. When it comes to Killzone, it looks like it wants to run at full speed, but it just kept crashing over and over. Again, all signs point to software issues here. And finally, Klonoa 2 runs okay, but just okay. It's a bit sluggish, but again, it can be fast forwarded and it's super smooth. I hope that sometime soon a new actively developed PS2 emulator will appear for Android, so that we can unlock more potential of boards like this. So we've looked at a lot of emulation in gaming in this section, and overall I have to say I am absolutely blown away by what you get with the orangepi 5 Plus. The performance here is second to none when it comes to SBCs, and against something like the Raspberry Pi 5, the orangepi 5 Plus just blows it away. I honestly never imagined that GameCube would be quite this good on this little SBC, but it's just amazing. And then when you factor in giant AAA Android games like Fortnite and Minecraft, there's really not much that you cannot do on this SBC. Hats off to orangepi for making a great Android build for this device. It works really well, it's blazing fast with that NVMe drive and network card, and I gotta say, overall in terms of performance, the orangepi 5 Plus is basically perfect. I think it's an incredible level of power. Oh, and of course, I just want to say, I'm really excited to see more handhelds with the RK3588 chip coming in the future. So as you can see, the performance here is incredibly impressive, especially for such a tiny board and at such a low price too. But what about my DIY project? Well, I gotta say, I absolutely love it actually. I'm really happy with the tilting screen design. I think the performance is fantastic, and I have actually been using it over the last couple of weeks as well. I think the touchscreen works perfectly for Android, and the Android operating system itself works really well too. However, there are a couple of improvements I'd like to make down the line. First of all, there's speaker buzz. This is a real problem, and I think I just need to isolate the ground. But basically, the audio pops a lot and it's buzzing. But that buzzing goes away as soon as there's consistent audio playing like music or video game noise. The speaker pop is really bad, and it generally happens whenever it goes from silent to playing audio. And along with that popping, sometimes the screen turns off as well. So clearly there's some issue with power to the speakers and power to the screen. I have no idea where to even begin troubleshooting this, so I'm just gonna ignore it. It never happens in-game, it only ever happens when I'm on the Android home screen. Next is the wires inside here are just kind of crushed into place any which way. And from the outside you can see these weird kind of folds in the FPC cables. Really, what I should have done is I should have routed the cables down the back through the hinge. But I think this is good enough for now. And finally, this bulge in the case. I'm not exactly sure which part is causing this, but I could definitely extend the case vertically a bit. Actually, of all things, I have no issue with the footprint of this console at all. And I would actually be really happy to make it a little taller. In fact, I think that would make it a better experience. So I might redesign it just to have a little bit more verticality in future. So this DIY games console, outside of some complications, was actually really simple and fun to make. The QLED screen is great, the speakers are great, and I think my design is actually pretty good too, if I do say so myself. And most importantly, the orangepi 5 Plus is just an absolutely amazing little SBC with some truly incredible performance. I highly recommend picking this up if you want to make your own DIY games console, even if it's just one that plugs into your TV. The performance here is really unmatched as far as SBCs go, and the available operating systems are really good too. I'll leave a link in the description box below for where you can pick up the orangepi 5 Plus for yourself. I'll also leave links to the wiki and the downloads page so you can find all the correct operating systems, and a couple of links for some of the accessories I used in this video as well. Let me know what you think of my DIY games console in the comment box below. And of course tell me if you've made one or if you want to make one for yourself. Even if you just want something that plugs into the TV, I think this is a great solution for that. And that's this one done. Thank you very much for watching Retro Breeze, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.